It certainly feels warm to be back home again, and I say home because being at MPH definitely feels like home. I spent a lot of my career here. In fact, everything I have done I learned from being at Mass General, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But hearing Nicole's story moved me to start this off with a very personal discussion in terms of why this work means a lot to me. When I was about 19, almost 20 or so, and I was in college, me and a good friend of mine, still my very good friend today, we were walking across the street. We were in college and we were going from one party to the next. And I can tell you at that point in my life, caring about things like politics or even grades for that matter was kind of lower on my agenda of important things. I was just becoming myself, I'll say, at that time. Walking across the street, and around the corner came about 3 or 4 police cars. Pulled us from where we were, and they kind of pulled us to the street, and they pulled us on the floor, and one of the cops got on my back and he handcuffed me. And as all this was going on, I was thinking, my God, think of all the things I've done wrong in life. How did they find out? Things I did when I was 16, I was like, wait, no, they don't know that, and they know all of these things. And it dawned on me for a good 15 to 20 minutes that I had no idea what they were doing. And so one cop, he was back behind me, he had his knee in my back, and he was kind of holding me down. And they held us there for about 45 minutes. And during all of that experience, at no point did they actually explain to us what was going on. So we could hear, though, as they were talking to the other cops, that they thought there was a suspect in the area, etc. And actually, one of the cops turned my friend over, and he was a little rough with him. And at no point did they explain anything to us at that point in time. And then, as we were walking by, as they were kind of doing that, a good friend of ours named Brian, who's student government president, was walking by. And Brian said, "Hey, let those guys go." And the cop said, they had a little quick conversation with Brian because he knew him. And then he said, "Okay, Brian," and then he actually just let us go. And it was kind of interesting because it made me realize on one of 2 things, and the main point I'm going to talk to you about today is a lot of times people live in 2 different worlds. And so the world I was living in that day was very different than the world that Brian was living in. Brian was in a point of authority where he could dictate what's going to happen in my life. And I was in a point of vulnerability where I was reliant on not just the police, but actually Brian, for whatever would happen to me the rest of that night. And when you pay attention to all this going across the news and all the things that people are talking about today, and a little bit about what I'm going to talk to you about, it's about this issue of people who live in 2 different worlds, even though they live right beside each other. And so Brian was a good friend, still is now a successful lawyer in DC. And what I realized that night was, even though we sat in the same class together and we went to the same parties together, Brian's worth was a lot more than mine, and who knows, it could have almost costed me my own life that night. And so I think about a lot of those things, and those things inspired a lot of the work that I ended up doing. And I'll give you a little bit more in terms of this kind of personal life trajectory. So, I kind of went through that experience, and it was a wake-up call for me, and I remember talking to my mom that night about life. She told me that the one thing that would make me become a person who would have more control of his own life was education. And so from that point on, I started taking education very seriously. Got out of college, went to medical school, and then I ended up here at Mass General for residency. I'll tell you a little bit about my MPH experience before I go into more about this 2 world. The MPH experience to me was defining in a number of different ways. When I got here, I still had that confidence in terms of self-worth, in terms of understanding my own worth compared to another person who had a different background and might have had more affluent settings and more affluent start than I did. But I met a number of interesting people. I met Rick Bringhurst when I first started here as a med student, and I came here and he started telling me how great a doctor I'd be, and I'm like, why is he being so nice to me? I can't do anything for him. And he was really nice. He kind of helped me understand how you go about training and things along those lines. I learned from a lot of great clinicians here about how to become a good doctor. I also learned from a number of folks in the community, Elmer Freeman, who's here today, and a lot of other folks about how do you do public health and how racism, all of the different things in life matter. Let me tell you a couple of quick slides to share with you what I mean by this issue of 2 different marriages. So here is a slide looking at differences in lifespan across the United States. And basically what you need to know here is if you're looking somewhere like Montgomery County, Maryland, people live to 81 years old. But then if you compare that to places like somewhere in South Carolina, people live to 69, 70 years old. And you say, well, there's differences in terms of where people live, and that's one issue. So this is another interesting slide looking at life expectancy in New Orleans. And what you see here is that if you go from one place in New Orleans that's about 50 minutes apart, you go from a life expectancy of 88 years old to a life expectancy of 55 years old. And I've given this talk to the medicine colleagues here, and I'll say what I said then, that's about the life expectancy of people living in Haiti. And so you say, well, that's New Orleans, there's all kinds of interesting challenges. And then you fast forward to where we are here in Boston, and it gives you a little bit of sense of the challenges. This is some data that was presented a couple of years ago, and this really kind of looks at this issue of social determinants of health. And what it basically shows is if you live in one of the zip codes in Roxbury, you may live to 58.9 years compared to somebody living in Back Bay. Now let me tell you what 58.9 years means in practical matters. That was where the rest of the country was in about 1920, 1925. Between the 1920 and 1925 was where you get to 58 years old. And so when you think about the fact that there are people who, and this is nothing of this is unique to Boston, this zip code analysis we see in almost every major city across our country right now. And what it means is that there are people who basically live almost 100 years behind the rest of us, and we walk past them and see them every day. So you might get on the T with somebody who is living in a world that is pretty far behind where we are today. And then we wonder when we turn on the television and we see things happening in Baltimore and St. Louis, and we see all these things where communities erupt, and they erupt because they've been living in the past for so long. And so they see us living in 2015, but they have living conditions and a future that is at least 100 years behind us. And I'll tell you that some of this data in terms of these numbers are kind of interesting, not all together things that I count on, but even if you look at some of the data from looking at the average African American life expectancy in Boston, which is around 68, 69 years old for African American men, round about where we were as a country back in the 1950s. And so this is all very, very real when we understand what the challenges are and understand what it is that we're facing as a country. And we don't need a protest, or we don't need something significant to happen for us to understand that these are things that we have to be not only cognizant of, but very, 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 very determined to solve. And that's why when we talk about the efforts of the Disparity Solution Center and all of the efforts of some of the folks you heard about here today, these are very, very, very real efforts for the peoples whose lives are impacted by these things. I can tell you, as somebody who's been through similar experiences. Let me close by saying a couple of things now, and that in terms of that was the past, and now let me talk a little bit about the future. When I gave this presentation here to the medicine group a couple of months ago, an interesting thing happened. I heard from a wave of different residents and trainees, some of them who were interested in all kinds of different things on subspecialty care and all these kinds of other kind of eclectic interests. One of the things they did care about were numbers like these. They cared about what it is that they could do to make this country better, make their community better, and make sure that we have a future where there is equity for all. And that's a part of the hope that we see here today. When we look at what's the substrate, I would say part of the substrate that we have is the young folks who come through training programs like these. And then I think about my own experience and how I was guided by folks like Liz Moore, who spent a whole year kind of training me and letting me understand about healthcare techniques. And I think about that, I would go out and I would learn in the community from folks like John Rich, who ran the Public Health Commission then, and he would teach me about community engagement. And I figured out you can be a good doctor, understand healthcare services research, and impact your community at the same time. And that's the kind of young folks that we have coming behind us. We also have a system here that is very much dedicated to solving these issues around healthcare equity and healthcare access. But here's what I would ask of you today as you leave here. Understand that these issues are not African American problems or Hispanic problems. These are real American problems. And if we really think about what we're talking about today, when we think about people and the lives they are living and experiences that they're having, and that you would probably walk past one of these people today as you walk out to your car, as you drive and you do your daily activities, then you know the onus of responsibility for what we need to do does not rest just with Joe and the work that he does. responsibility, but really rests with all of us. And I'll close by saying one thing my dad taught me. He taught me two things. I hope that I did the first thing. My dad taught me, whenever you come to somebody's home and they give you something, start off by telling them thanks. And so MPH, Boston, a lot of my mentors and people who I see here in the audience, they gave me a lot. And I want to certainly say thank you for all that you've done. And I hope to use what you taught me to hopefully make the world a better place. The second thing I'll say my dad taught me was, he said, there were 3 boys who were implicitly lazy, in fact we still are. On the weekends, my dad would, we had this huge yard outside that the grass would grow continuously. And he would say, I'm not going to tell you that you need to cut the grass because you already have the onus of responsibility to cut that grass because you know it's there. And so whether you decide to do something about it or not, that doesn't stop the grass from growing. I'll tell you that these kinds of challenges that we're talking about here today, they continue to impact our community. And the onus of responsibility doesn't just belong to the people on the podium and the people in elected office. They belong to companies, they belong to community leaders, they belong to clinicians, they belong to young people, old people, everybody in between. And if you want to ignore that the grass is growing, it doesn't stop it from growing. It just means that it'll be taller when you decide to tackle it. Right? And so that's one thing my dad taught us that we realized when we would get out there a couple weeks later, when it would just be harder to mow. But that was to get around the reality that the grass is growing. So I will tell you that from my own personal experience, there's a lot going on here in Boston. There's a committed group in terms of not just elected officials, but you see here from Dr. Slavin and others, and there's a lot we can learn from them. And we need to think about how we bring all of the things that we do to bear and all those communities that need it across the country to make sure that what we really have now are communities that are living in 2015. And so the last thing I said before is to say again, thank you, but more importantly, remember that onus of responsibility for dealing with all of these challenges rests with all of us today. Thank you.